Hey everyone, in this video we'll be integrating Git with VS Code as well as adding some configurations to our git config file. I also have a video on how to set up VS Code for data science that's linked in the description if you want to check it out. So this is where we left off in our last video, where we have this git practice folder which we initialized into a git repository using git init. And if we check all the contents of this folder, it will essentially give us that .git folder, which is what gives a normal workspace or a normal folder the identity of a git repository. Now let us open VS Code from here, right? So there are two ways you can open this workspace from VS Code. One is you can simply use this command code space dot, and it will end up opening VS Code directly from under this folder, right? But for this option, for this code space dot option to work, you need to configure VS Code in your path environment variable. If it's not configured, then this will not work. You can also open any folder from within VS Code itself by using Ctrl plus K plus O, and that will give you the option of just going to your folder and opening it up. Now right off the bat, you can see that VS Code has recognized that this folder is a git repository and that we are on branch master. And if you select source control option from the sidebar, it will give you this panel, which is going to be one of the more important panels when it comes to working with Git in VS Code. Before we dive into source control and other options that VS Code provides us, let us download an extension. It's called Gitlens. So Gitlens essentially is a graphical user interface or a GUI client that sits on top of Git and allows us to visualize complex Git history or workflows. And you will see once we start adding Git commits how it will help you just visualize a lot of things which might be difficult for you to visualize from within the command line. So let us install this. Okay, so now that this is installed, let us close this, go back to source control and open PowerShell session using Ctrl plus backtick. So now let us delete our .git folder and notice what happens as we do that under our source control. So we'll remove item, force, recurse and .git. So now that that is removed, let us refresh this. It's telling us that this is not a git repository because we deleted .git folder. Now under source control, it is also giving us the option to initialize the repository. So let us initialize it using VS Code this time. So the moment we select that, it will initialize this as a git repository. But one difference, as you can notice here as well as on the lower left corner, is that this time VS Code has initialized git repository using main as the default initial branch instead of master when we did it using command line. Now, how do we select the default initial branch name, or how do we come up with the naming convention for our Git branches? Those aspects we'll discuss in detail when we get into Git branches and branching workflows. But for now, just remember, if we use git init, it will initialize it as a Git repository using master as a default branch. But if we want to initialize it using a different branch name, then we can do that. In fact, let us do that. Let us remove our .git folder. So this again becomes not a Git repository. So we'll do what VS Code did, in that we'll initialize this as a Git repository, but with main as our default initial branch instead of master. So we can do that using this argument. So git init -- initial branch, and we can actually name anything here, right? But let us just name random branch. So this will initialize this folder as a Git repository, but this time the default branch would be random. And you can see that VS Code has detected that here. We can also rename the branch by using this command git branch -m. We'll rename it to master. Okay. And there it is. Let us try to add a git commit. Don't worry about the details. We will be diving deep into Git workflow in the next video. This is just to drive home the point why Git configurations are necessary. Let us add a new file, right? So we'll just add a new file .text. And the moment we do that, notice there is a change in our prompt. And that change is basically indicating to us that we have added a new object, in this case a new file, that is yet not committed to Git history. So let us do that. Now there are two parts to committing to our Git history. The first one is where we add that new object. Second one is where we actually commit to our Git history. In this case, we'll just add it as our first commit. Again, we'll go into the details of what these commands mean, what's the difference between adding something or committing something later. And the moment we try to commit this, it will give us this error. Git wants to know the identity of the author that it can attribute this change to. So someone added this new file and Git wants to know who was that person. And that makes sense, right? For instance, if you are part of a team where multiple data scientists and machine learning engineers are working on the same machine learning model, not only do you want to track changes being made to the code base at all times, but you also want to track the identity of the person who is making those changes, which is why Git would not allow you to commit anything to your Git history without first configuring these two properties in your git config file. The error itself is very descriptive, where it's asking you to run these two commands, which essentially would add your email address as well as your name to git config file. Now before we run these two commands, let us find out how many git config files we have in our system and where they are located. So for that, you just need to run this git config --list --show -origin. This is one git config file with its configurations or properties, and this is another git config file which is located directly in our git repository, right? So remember .git folder which we initialized, if we list all the contents under that folder, one of them would be our git config file. So these two are the current locations where we have our git configuration files, but the moment we run this command, it will also create another git config file directly under our user profile with these two properties added. So now let us just run this command, right? So we'll just run this command, and my email address being this, and we'll also run the command where we are adding our name. Okay, so I'll just add my name, Meet. Now let us once again run that git config list show origin to see our config files. And if you notice, we have the two config files which we already had previously, but one more config file has been added to our system under my user profile with these two properties. We can even go ahead and open those configuration files, right? So we'll basically just open this git config file, and we can see we have added these two properties for the current user. So now if we commit, we would be allowed to make the commit, and that commit would carry this particular identity. So let us just make our git commit, right? So git commit -m, and our message again would be first commit, and this time it will go through just fine. If we use this command git log, which gives us the history of our git commits, you can see the last commit had the message first commit. It was made by this particular email address and this particular person. Now let us open all these three git configuration files in VS Code, right? So we've already opened the one which was under our user profile. Let us open the one which is directly under our program files, git, and under etc folder. This one was just git config. Okay, so let us open the one which is under our root project. C drive and users, math and machines, git practice, .git and config. Right, so now that these three files are open, the thing to remember about them is that the one which is directly under our root project, right? So that would be this config file. It has what we call local scope. Okay, the one which is .config file, which is under our user profile, that has global scope, right? Which is why, if you remember, the command that we used to generate and modify this file was git config global. So we were purposefully adding this configuration to our global scope. Git config file, which we had in our program files etc folder, has system scope. And the reason why these scopes are important is because if you have the same set of properties shared between all these config files, then the ones which you have in your local config file, which would be .git config, would enjoy a higher precedence compared to the ones which you have in your global scope, which would be your user profile .git config file, which in turn would enjoy a higher precedence compared to your system scope changes, which would be under your etc folder git config. Let us do a quick demo of that. So we'll take this user level properties which we configured in our .git config, which is global scope, and add them to config, which would be local scope. But we'll also change the email address, right? So we'll make it something like superrandom89, and then we'll have this as meet random. Okay. So now we have a situation where we have some user properties in our global scope, which are not the same as the ones which we have in our local scope. So now let us make some changes in our new file. So we'll basically just add a dummy line, and you'll see now what the prompt is telling us is we have not added any new file, but whatever files we already had, we have added a line to that existing file. So let us add those changes, and let us also commit it, right? And this would be our second commit. Clear this and check out our git logs, and notice this part, right? So our first commit had meet and math and machines as our email address, but our second commit now has this meet random as well as that super random email address that we changed, right, in our local scope. Any changes in your local scope will always override any changes you have in your global scope, which in turn will do the same vis-a-vis system level scope. So just something to remember, just get rid of this. There is one more change that we need to make to our git config file, and that is our default editor. So remember, when we installed Git in our installation wizard, one of the options that Git was providing us was to change our default editor, and it was Vim by default, and it was asking if we wanted to change it. So let us first give an example of why we might need to change our default editor. Let me add another line to my new file, right? So this would be hello world from second line. Obviously we have modified it and it's showing up on the prompt. Now let us add that and let us commit, but this time let us not give it an explicit commit message, right? Let us just type git commit and see what it does. Okay, the moment we do that, it still needs that message. Because we did not give it an explicit message, it's sending us to its default editor, in this case Vim, for us to type the message. Now people have interesting attitude towards Vim. Some people absolutely love it to the point where they despise everything else. But if you're only starting out, if you've never worked with Vim before, then it can get quite tedious because it has its own process, its own flow, which is quite different from what you're normally used to, which is why we need to configure a more intuitive code editor. Instead of adding any message here, we'll just exit by typing :Q, right? And in this case, it did not go ahead with the commit because we did not add any message. So what we'll do now is we'll use this command to config our default editor. Again, we are adding this configuration to our global config file. So it will be git config global core.editor equals code -- wait. And again, for this option to work, you need to have VS Code added to your path variable. And if you don't know how to do that, then just check out my VS Code video. Oh, I forgot the double hyphen. So it's git config -- global. So now it has added VS Code to our default editor. So if we again try to commit without adding any message, okay, another mistake. There is no equal, right? You basically just add this. Let us try to commit again. Now it will actually open another window in this VS Code and ask us to add the commit message. So that same window that we saw open in Vim has now opened in VS Code, and it's now quite simple. We just add our message, and this is our third commit. We save it and we close this. And as soon as we do that, that message has been added. We can check our git logs, and as you can see, we've added our commit message with this user details. So that's pretty much it for this video. In the next video, we'll be discussing Git workflow in detail.